which they themselves haven't been able to convey.
I understand. Let me move on to a different kind of question. I think it's very hard to define the themes of most poets. And your poetry is also, I think, extremely elusive as far as themes go. But one fairly consistent ingredient in your work is, I think, nature. It occurs often as a background to your poems and sometimes as of co-equal importance with man. It provides a kind of, to me, inexplicable, almost mysterious element in your work. Would you perhaps define the function of nature more adequately than I am managing?
Yes, this is a difficult question. Not writing within some theories or out of some literary theories of poetry, but having my own conception, which is in some way not a methodic one, I can just say that nature itself is in fact not the dominant part of my poetry. Nature is only used as a sort of my, would say, private or my own dictionary, which helps me to describe some condition humaine, some specific situation.
Can I interrupt you and ask
Yes.
a question then? Would you consider yourself as a poet who uses nature really as a metaphor to illuminate the inner condition of human beings?
I wouldn't say that I use nature as a metaphor. I use nature as a more concrete language than words.
But your poems are written in words.
Yes, but you know exactly, I mean, that whole words are subjected to a sort of inflation. Words which themselves cannot, of course, give the poem what a poem, in my judgment, should be. You know that in nowadays there's a lot of talk about what we call concrete poetry. The spiritual father, in fact, is the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. But it is the philosophy which concerns philological themes, or I would say the limits of language, the way of usage of language, has been so misinterpreted that I'm sure that Wittgenstein, if he would be alive today, he would himself, as the first man, disassociate from concrete poetry, or most of concrete poetry, as it is written today. Just to exemplify that, Wittgenstein himself, in his memoirs, has mentioned that the most loved poet, or the poet which he esteems the most, is Trakl. And of course Trakl was very far to be what we call a concrete poet. I mentioned this concrete poetry just to illustrate you how words can be used some way in a very nonsense way, or in a way that in fact are part of some repetitive acoustic meanings. The words do not convey anything which for me would mean poetry.
Mm-hmm. There are many people, I think, in England who would disagree in a way with what you're saying. They would say that concrete poetry is a valid form in itself, even if it isn't exactly what has been traditionally meant by the word poetry. But to come back to this question of nature, if you use nature as how can I put it, an instrument for comparison with man's predicament, is there a danger of your distorting what nature really looks like?
No, I'm not quarreling with nature. It's not to be presented as a sort of battle with nature. I'm just taking parts of landscape, or what we say, objets de nature, and activize them in my poems in a way that they work instead of words.
You mean that the objects themselves are given significance so that you don't have to describe what is actually happening inside man. You make the objects, as it were, act out the kind of inner drama of human beings.
Yes, I would say they are more presented, I would say, in border situations, in edge, where everything is put on some edge, and therefore they are intergame of the words of the nature references is more to give the dramatic clearness of the situation.
I see. So that in a sense the objects in nature act out a kind of drama which is also, as it were, occurring inside human beings at the same time. There is a kind of mirroring going on.
There's a sign, I would say, of parallelism going on between some drama in the nature and the drama in the human being.
I understand. That's very clear. Let me move on to one final question now. It's a general question, but I think there's a lot you could say about it. Do you think that there's now such a phenomenon as Israeli poetry? And if there is, do you think that you are in any way typical of this phenomenon?
I would start my reply with the last passage of your question. It is not for me to define or to judge how far I do belong to the, or can be incorporated into this phenomenon, what you call Israeli poetry.
Do you think it exists, in fact?
I think it exists in some way. It seems, there's a limited number of poets where you can say that Israel as a landscape, Israel as a country with specific political and human situations is reflected in their poetry. But there are a lot of poets where, of course, where you cannot in fact see that they belong to this country, then you could, apart of the fact that they have been written in Hebrew, you don't know whether they belong to Israel or to England. Just to mention, when I speak about the phenomenon of Israeli poetry, I would say there are poets who have written on the war of liberation, like Chaim Guri, like Amichai, there are poets like Amir Gilboa, who has interpreted some biblical themes in a very original way, which it seems to be that only somebody who is living in Israel could have done it.
I understand. And would you associate yourself with any of these descriptions?
Yes, I would say I myself feel that I'm too much rooted in Israel, and just to tell you that I have hardly written a poem outside Israel.
But what about the internal evidence in the poems, as it were?
I would say every part of this country, not to speak about Jerusalem, which is, in fact, I would say haunting me.
Haunting you?
Haunting me.
And hunting you, perhaps.
In some way. Every part of this country is reflected in my poetry. I mean...
The landscape or more
not
than
the
that?
landscape, I would say especially the border situations. Then for me also, when I speak about the Negev, the Negev is in fact a sort of border. When you come to Beersheba and you see till this, in this part or this line, that civilization reaches, and from there onwards only the wilderness is starting. So you have a border situation which is also a human situation for me. Then the man who is on the border must face, in fact, look forward and backward in some way.
So back towards civilization and forwards towards the wilderness.
To wilderness, or vice versa.
All right, thank you very much, David Rokeach.
Thank you very much, John Silkin.